Our third speaker today is Hassan Tayyab. He's a co-director of Just Foreign Policy. He is immensely involved in various grassroots lobbying efforts for peace in Yemen, which contributed to the Senate passage, of SJR Resolution 54, the War Powers Resolution Act, to end U.S. involvement in the Saudi war on Yemen. Thank you, Hassan, for your efforts on that. He has worked with numerous advocacy organizations, including Freedom Works, Defense Priorities, In Defense of Christians, the Koch Institute, FCNL, Win Without War, Committee for Responsible Foreign Policy, Demand Progress, Yemen Peace Project, Peace Action, and many others. Hassan has also taken dozens of meetings with congressional offices alongside national security expert Colonel Larry Wilkerson, who served as Colin Powell's chief of staff during the Bush administration. Hassan, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. So let's look back. So some of this is going to be a little bit of a repeat, and some of it's going to be, my perspective on what happened. 2011 Arab Spring, there was a coup in the country, a takeover, and what resulted is the Vice President Hadi became the interim president of Yemen. He was supposed to be there for 2 years, and he stayed past that interim period, and Yemen was supposed to move to a more representative form of democracy and government. In that time, there was corruption, unemployment, food insecurity, and it led to the uprising between Saleh and the Houthis. And so there was a lot of disillusionment about the transition. So at that time, they actually the Houthis reached out to Iran for support, and Iran actually at that moment said, this is not a strategic priority for us. We're going to, we have other priorities in the region. We're not going to be able to contribute to this revolution. So coalition troops landed in Aden in August 2015, and thus began this horrible war. And I mean, we haven't really talked about the humanitarian crisis, in numbers yet, but we've got about 12 million people on the brink of famine, 1.2 million cases of cholera, 10,000 new cases each week. It's just heartbreaking to see the kind of devastation. I am specifically focused on how the U.S. is involved. So the U.S. has been backing the Saudi and UAE-led coalition. We've been giving them mid-air refueling, targeting assistance. We've been supplying Saudi Arabia with most of their military force, most of their military equipment. And so that's the kind of perspective I'm taking is we can't control other people necessarily, but we can control what we do in this country. And one thing that we have to do is understand that we are perpetuating this by supporting the coalition, through the means I just mentioned. Now, also, we have to look at our own Constitution. What does it say under Article 1, Section 8 of our Constitution? Congress has the power to declare war, and that's the vehicle that we're using in Congress, because this war started under the Obama administration and is, continued on in the Trump administration, but we have never gotten a declaration of war or a statutory authorization from Congress. So right early on in the conflict, the Saudi and UAE-led coalition, they used their air force supplied by the United States military. They took out agricultural infrastructure, economic infrastructure. Immediately, they took out the sewage infrastructure, and it's this has created the really difficult conditions on the ground. So let's take a look a little bit about the congressional effort to pull U.S. support. So there was initially a vote in 2017 in the House that didn't really get anywhere. We had trouble even convincing Congress that we were, supporting the Saudi UAE coalition. They said, well, we're not even involved at all. And so we kept pressing the issue. We had another vote in the Senate in March 2018, and that got a little further. We got 44 senators to vote with us. And I think it's crucial I think the U.S., our role is, the reason why I bring it up in the context of the origins of this conflict is because I really feel like the United States is playing a major role in this conflict. After that vote, there was a compromise piece of legislation where we required the Secretary of State then Rex Tillerson. It's hard to keep track of the revolving door in the Trump administration, but Mike Pompeo became Secretary of State, and he was required under the National Defense Authorization Act to basically recertify that Saudi and the UAE coalition were doing everything they could to protect civilians. And right after the passage of that, there was the tragic bus bombing in August where a Raytheon rocket hit a school bus and killed 40 children. And right after that, Mike Pompeo came out before Congress and said Saudi Arabia and the UAE are doing everything they can to protect civilians in pretty much one of the bloodiest months for civilians. We're talking about a 50%, for all the airstrikes, about 50% of those were hitting civilian targets. Since the start of the war, 18,000 bombs have been dropped on Yemen, and a third of those have hit civilians. So it's just devastating, the tragedy of this. So after that, Congress said, we can no longer sit by. They reintroduced the War Powers Act of 1973, and that was introduced by Ro Khanna in the House, and then Senator Bernie Sanders, Mike Lee, and Chris Murphy. So each of these efforts were bipartisan. This is not a partisan issue, and I'm really proud of that fact, that we're able to, take a look at this from different angles and come to the same conclusion that it's probably time to end our support for the Saudi and UAE coalition. So in December 13th, this was the first time since the original passage of the War Powers Act in 45 years that the Senate actually passed this, and they passed it with a 56-vote majority. And that actually, I agree that there's a lot of reason to be pessimistic, but each time Congress has reasserted its war authority, we've seen tiny breakthroughs in the peace talks. So UN Special Envoy to Yemen, Martin Griffiths, was able to secure a ceasefire on that same day that the Senate passed this bill. And regardless of who we want to blame, I don't really want to be in the blame game. I think there is blame to be had on both sides, but we want people to talk, and we want the two sides to conduct dialogue. So that was a fragile ceasefire, and that it was just supposed to be in the province of Hodeidah, which is Yemen's largest port. This is where a lot of the humanitarian aid gets into the country. So that's been a fragile ceasefire. The House passed another War Powers resolution in January, and that fragile ceasefire got a little boost of energy, and the two sides were able to say, well, maybe we can redeploy forces and military out of the Hodeidah province. So that's where we are right now. Next week, we have a vote in the Senate again. And there's a lot of ping-ponging kind of going back and forth. And we're doing a lot of grassroots advocacy work. He read all those groups that we were, it's kind of weird to be in a coalition with the Koch brothers and Code Pink at the same time. And, I love that. I really do. And I believe that, I personally believe that we keep pushing on this grassroots advocacy stuff, and that if people keep making their voices heard, I believe that we can pull U.S. support for the war and continue to put pressure on pressure to keep the peace talks going, and that we can have a better future for Yemen.
Thank you very much.